This 1913 company baseball photo looks fun until you study the fence. The image sat in a Tennessee estate sale for 3 weeks before anyone bothered to look closely. It seemed wholesome enough. 9 men in matching uniforms knelt with wooden bats, while 4 suited managers stood behind them with their arms crossed, proud as any owner of a winning team. Until one detail would not let go. Sarah Mendelson bought the photograph on a Saturday morning in April 2019. She ran a small archive consulting business out of Nashville, the kind of work that meant driving to church basements and musty attics to sort through boxes of uncatalogued documents for historical societies that could not afford a full-time archivist. Most of what she found was mundane: deeds, receipts, graduation programs, the paperwork of ordinary lives. But Sarah had trained herself to notice when something felt staged, when a photograph worked too hard to say everything is fine here. The photo measured 11 by 14 inches, mounted on thick cardboard that had yellowed at the edges. The team name across the jerseys read Sloss Sheffield in block letters. The field behind them stretched away toward a wooden fence, and beyond that the blurred outline of industrial buildings, smokestacks, ore yards. The men in the front row had their gloves resting on their knees, and most of them were smiling. A few looked straight at the camera with that frozen intensity people had in long exposure shots. One man in the back row, second from the left, was not smiling at all. Sarah set the photo on her kitchen table under a lamp and leaned in. She had been doing this work for 11 years, ever since finishing her master's thesis on labor photography in the early 20th century South. She knew how to read a staged image. The managers stood too close to the players, their hands positioned to suggest ownership. The uniforms were too clean for men who worked in a mine. And then there was the fence. At first it looked like weathered wood, the kind of outfield barrier you would expect at any industrial ballpark. But when Sarah tilted the photo under the light, she saw something underneath the paint. Numbers. Faint, hand-painted numbers running along the top rail of the fence, each one about 6 inches tall. They had been painted over in white, but the original black showed through in places where the newer coat had worn thin. She could make out a 7, a 4, maybe a 1. Then a gap. Then what looked like a 2 and an 8. Sarah felt the familiar pull. This is not just a pretty old photo. Something here is wrong. She had been consulting for nearly a decade before opening her own practice, working first at the Vanderbilt Archives and then freelancing for county historical societies across Tennessee and Alabama. She had cataloged thousands of images, farm families, church groups, school portraits. She knew the grammar of early 20th century photography, the way studios lit their subjects, the props they used, the backgrounds they painted. This photo had all the marks of a company commission. Sloss Sheffield wanted proof of their enlightened management, their happy workers, their American pastime played out in the shadow of the furnaces. But the numbers on that fence kept pulling her attention. She turned the photo over. On the back, written in pencil in a tight script, someone had noted, "Team photo, 1913, Sloss Sheffield, number 2, mine." Below that, a second line in different handwriting, "Property of J.R. Whitmore Estate." Sarah opened her laptop and typed Sloss Sheffield, Birmingham into the search bar. The company had been one of the largest iron and steel producers in the South, operating blast furnaces and coal mines throughout Jefferson County. The name still appeared on historical markers and museum plaques around Birmingham. Sloss Furnaces was now a National Historic Landmark, a preserved industrial site where tourists walked through the old casting sheds and learned about the men who had poured molten iron in 100-degree heat. She refined the search. Sloss Sheffield, 1913. Then she added a term she had been thinking about since she first saw those numbers: convict leasing. The results filled her screen. Academic articles, digitized newspaper archives, photographs of men in striped uniforms standing in mine shafts. She clicked on a scan from a 1912 state report and read, "The Sloss Sheffield Company currently leases 187 convicts for work in mines number 1, number 2, and number 3. Lease payments to the state amount to $18.50 per convict per month." Sarah sat back. She looked at the photo again, at the men kneeling with their bats, at the managers standing behind them, at the fence with its half-hidden numbers. She called Michael Reeves the next morning. He taught history at the University of Alabama and had published 2 books on convict leasing in the post-Reconstruction South. Sarah had met him 4 years earlier at a conference in Atlanta, and they had stayed in touch, trading research leads and document scans. When she described the photo, Michael went quiet for a moment. "Send me a high-resolution image," he said. "I want to see those numbers." Sarah spent the afternoon scanning the photograph at 1200 dpi, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out every detail. She sent the file to Michael and waited. He called back 2 hours later. "I pulled the records from the Alabama Board of Inspectors of Convicts," he said. "They kept logs of every man leased out, including ID numbers. Sloss Sheffield used a numbering system that matched the states. The numbers on that fence, the ones you can see, they line up with the range assigned to prisoners working at mine number 2 in 1913. "So the fence," Sarah said slowly, "was from the prison camp." "Or it was used at the camp and then moved to the ball field," Michael said. "Either way, those numbers marked people. And if half that team was leased convicts, then Sloss Sheffield staged this photo to make forced labor look like recreation." Sarah asked the question she already knew the answer to. "How do we find out who they were?" Michael paused. "That's going to take some digging, but I know where to start." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah and Michael worked through archives on opposite ends of the state. Michael drove to Montgomery to review the convict lease records held by the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Sarah went to Birmingham, where the Birmingham Public Library kept the company records that Sloss Sheffield had donated in the 1970s after the corporation dissolved. She sat in the archives room on the 4th floor, pulling boxes of payroll ledgers, injury reports, and company correspondence. The payroll records divided workers into 2 categories: free labor and leased labor. In July 1913, mine number 2 employed 214 free laborers and 91 leased convicts. The leased men had numbers instead of full names in some columns. No 174, no 228, no 301. Sarah cross-referenced the numbers against the company's own medical logs, which recorded injuries and causes of death. The logs were clinical and brief. No 174, crushed foot, returned to camp. No 195, heat exhaustion, died on site. No 228, laceration, treated and returned to work. She found the baseball team reference in a folder marked Public Relations, 1912 to 1914. A typed memo from the mine superintendent to the company president, dated June 1913, outlined plans for a company-sponsored baseball league. To improve morale and demonstrate to local civic groups that our operations foster healthy recreation among workers, we propose organizing teams at each mine site. Games will be played on Sunday afternoons. Photographs will be taken for distribution to newspapers. Another memo, dated 2 weeks later, specified the roster for the mine number 2 team. It listed 13 names, 9 for the starting lineup and 4 alternates. Next to each name was a notation: free or leased. As Sarah counted, 6 of the 13 were marked leased. She photographed every page with her phone, then sat with the images on the screen, staring at the names. The free laborers had full names and sometimes home addresses listed. The leased men had only last names and their convict numbers. Jackson, number 228. Taylor, number 174. Harris, number 301. That evening, Sarah met Michael at a diner near the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. She showed him the memos. He had brought his own files, printouts from the state archives. The Board of Inspectors of Convicts kept intake records for every prisoner leased out, including the charge that led to their arrest and the length of their sentence. Michael had matched the convict numbers from the baseball roster to the state logs. No, 228, Robert Jackson, he read aloud. Arrested in Montgomery, March 1911, charge of vagrancy, sentenced to 2 years hard labor, leased to Sloss Sheffield. No, 174, William Taylor, arrested in Selma, January 1912, charge of gambling, sentenced to 18 months, leased to Sloss Sheffield. No, 301, Samuel Harris, arrested in Birmingham, August 1912, charge of selling whiskey without a license, sentenced to 1 year, leased to Sloss Sheffield. Vagrancy, gambling, selling whiskey, Sarah said. Those charges were pretexts. They arrested black men on anything they could, then leased them out for labor. Michael nodded. It was a system. Sheriffs got paid for every arrest. Judges got paid for every conviction. The state got lease payments. And companies like Sloss Sheffield got workers they could drive as hard as they wanted with no accountability. He tapped the printout. Look at the mortality rate. In 1913 alone, Sloss Sheffield reported 23 deaths among leased convicts. That's out of fewer than 200 men. The state barely investigated. Sarah thought about the photo again, the men kneeling with bats, the managers standing behind them. So Sloss Sheffield forced these men to work in the mines 6 days a week, then made them play baseball on Sundays to prove the company treated them well. It was public relations, Michael said. If you could show the public that your workers played sports and smiled for the camera, you could diffuse criticism about working conditions. And if half the team was leased convicts, no one looking at the photo would know. They all wore the same uniforms. They all held the same bats. Sarah asked the question she had been avoiding. Do we know what happened to them? Jackson, Taylor, Harris? Michael flipped through his notes. Robert Jackson completed his sentence in March 1913. No record of him after that. William Taylor died in the mine in November 1913. The cause of death was listed as accidental crushing. Samuel Harris was released in August 1913, a month after this photo was probably taken. I don't know where he went. They sat in silence. Around them, the diner hummed with the noise of families eating Sunday dinner. Sarah looked out the window at the street, at the buildings that had replaced the old industrial core of Birmingham. Somewhere under all that gentrification and new construction were the sites where men like Jackson and Taylor and Harris had been worked to exhaustion and death. We need to go to the mine site, Sarah said. The next morning, they drove east out of Birmingham toward the area that had once been Mine Number 2. Most of the old Sloss Sheffield operations had been demolished or absorbed into other industrial sites, but Michael had located the approximate coordinates using old surveyor maps. The mine itself had been sealed in the 1950s, but the surface structures had left traces. They parked on a gravel access road and walked into a scrubby field. Fragments of brick foundation poked through the weeds. Rusted metal posts leaned at angles. A concrete pad marked where a building had stood. Sarah took photos while Michael consulted a hand-drawn map he had copied from a 1914 company site plan. Ball field would have been over there, he said, pointing toward a flat area near the tree line. And the convict camp was just beyond it, separated by a fence. They walked toward the flat ground. The field was overgrown now, thick with kudzu and young pine trees, but Sarah could still see the rough outline of a cleared space. At the far end, barely visible through the undergrowth, stood a section of wooden fence, weathered gray and leaning to one side. She felt her pulse quicken. Is that it? They pushed through the brush until they reached the fence. It was old, maybe not original, but it followed the line Michael had marked on the map. Sarah ran her hand along the top rail, feeling the grain of the wood, the places where paint had once covered the surface. And then she saw it. Faint, almost gone, but still there. A number carved into the wood, 228. Michael crouched next to her. They carved the numbers too, he said quietly. Not just painted them. They wanted them permanent. Sarah took photos from every angle, capturing the number, the fence, the field behind it. She thought about Robert Jackson standing here in 1913, wearing a Sloss Sheffield uniform, holding a bat, forced to smile for a photograph that would be used to say everything was fine. She thought about the men who had died in the mines, their deaths recorded in ledgers as accidents, their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside the prison camp. She thought about the managers standing in the back row of the photo, arms crossed, satisfied with the image they had created. When they returned to Birmingham, Sarah began drafting a report. She had been hired by the Tennessee Historical Society that was preparing to accession the Whitmore estate, but this was bigger than a simple cataloging job. The photo was evidence. It documented a crime that had been hidden behind the language of recreation and morale. She wrote up her findings and included Michael's research, then sent the draft to the Historical Society's director. The response came 3 days later, a phone call, not an email. The director, a man named Charles Hammond, sounded careful. This is compelling work, Sarah, very thorough. But we need to think about how we present this. Present what? Sarah asked. The convict leasing aspect, Hammond said. The photo is a valuable acquisition, and we want to include it in our upcoming exhibition on Southern industrial history. But we have donors who are sensitive about framing companies like Sloss Sheffield in a negative light. Some of those donors are descendants of the families who ran these operations. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The photo is literally evidence of forced labor. The numbers on the fence match prisoner IDs. This isn't framing. This is fact. I understand, Hammond said. But facts can be presented in different ways. We can mention that the company used convict leasing, but we don't need to make the whole story about exploitation. We can focus on the broader context of industrial growth in the New South. So you want me to soften it? Hammond paused. I want us to be thoughtful. The Historical Society depends on donations and memberships. If we alienate our base, we lose funding. And if we lose funding, we can't preserve any history. Sarah spent the next 2 days thinking about what to do. She understood the pressures Hammond faced. Historical societies operated on thin budgets, and donors had power. But the men in that photo, the ones who had been leased as convicts, they had no power when the image was made, and they had no voice in how it was interpreted now. If the Historical Society displayed the photo with a caption about industrial growth and left out the convict leasing, then Sloss Sheffield's public relations strategy would succeed a century later. She called Michael. They want to bury it, she said. Then we don't let them, Michael said. You own the research. I have the state records. We publish it ourselves. Over the next 6 months, Sarah and Michael worked with a journalist at the Birmingham News who had been covering the city's efforts to reckon with its history of racial violence and economic exploitation. The journalist, a woman named Keisha Thornton, had written extensively about convict leasing in Alabama, and she saw the baseball photo as a perfect case study. The image had been used to sell a lie, and now it could be used to expose the system behind the lie. The article ran in February 2020 with a full scan of the photo and a detailed breakdown of the research. Sarah and Michael were both quoted. The piece traced the lives of the leased convicts who had been on the team, included excerpts from the company memos, and ended with a question. How many other photographs in museum collections and family albums carried hidden evidence of forced labor, and how long would institutions continue to look away? The response was immediate. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute reached out to ask if they could include the photo in a planned exhibit on convict leasing and mass incarceration. A documentary filmmaker contacted Sarah about developing the story for a short film. Descendants of some of the free laborers on the team wrote to say they had never known their grandfathers had played alongside leased convicts, and they wanted to learn more. But there was also pushback. The Tennessee Historical Society issued a statement saying they had intended to include information about convict leasing in their exhibition, but that Sarah's decision to go public had forced them to reconsider acquiring the Whitmore estate materials at all. A few descendants of Sloss Sheffield executives wrote angry letters to the Birmingham News, arguing that the company had been a product of its time and that judging it by modern standards was unfair. Sarah read the letters, but did not respond. She was already working on the next phase. Michael had connected her with a genealogist in Montgomery who specialized in tracing the descendants of people who had been caught in the convict leasing system. The genealogist, a woman named Patricia Green, had spent years reconstructing families that had been torn apart by arrests, sentences, and deaths in the mines. Patricia found a lead on Samuel Harris, the man who had been released in August 1913. His name appeared in a church registry in Bessemer, Alabama, dated 1920. The entry listed him as a member of Mount Zion Baptist Church, along with his wife, Clara, and 3 children. Patricia tracked the family through census records and city directories. Samuel Harris had worked as a janitor after his release, lived in a rented house on 3rd Avenue, and died in 1947. His obituary in the Birmingham World, a black newspaper, made no mention of his time at Sloss Sheffield. Patricia also found Clara Harris's oral history, recorded in 1968, as part of a project by a local college. In the interview, Clara talked about raising her children during the Depression, about the church's role in the community, about her husband's long hours and his reluctance to talk about the past. Near the end of the interview, the student asked if Samuel had ever worked in the mines. Clara's answer was brief. He did for a time. He did not like to speak of it. It was a hard place. Sarah listened to the recording, Clara's voice thin and distant through the decades of magnetic tape degradation, and felt the weight of what had been lost. Samuel Harris had survived the mines, but the system had marked him. He had been forced to play baseball for men who saw him as property, forced to smile for a photograph that erased his suffering. And then he had lived 50 more years, working and raising a family, carrying the memory of that coercion in silence. In June 2021, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute opened an exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight: Photographs and the Architecture of Oppression. The baseball photo was the centerpiece, displayed on a large wall with an annotated key identifying each person in the image. Next to the photo, the museum had installed text panels explaining convict leasing in Alabama, the role of companies like Sloss Sheffield, and the legal mechanisms that made the system possible. One panel included excerpts from the company memos Sarah had found, showing how management had explicitly planned to use the baseball team for public relations. Another panel told the stories of Robert Jackson, William Taylor, and Samuel Harris. Jackson's story ended with a question mark, no record of his life after 1913. Taylor's story ended with his death in the mine at age 26. Harris's story included a photograph of Mount Zion Baptist Church and a quote from Clara's oral history. The museum had also tracked down one of Samuel Harris's great-granddaughters, a woman named Angela Davis who lived in Atlanta. Angela had contributed a family photograph of Samuel taken in the 1930s, a portrait of a man in a dark suit, his expression serious, his hands folded in his lap. Sarah attended the exhibition's opening. She stood in front of the baseball photo and watched visitors stop, read the panels, lean in to study the fence. Some took pictures with their phones, others stood silently. A few asked questions of the museum docents who had been trained to talk about convict leasing, to explain how the system worked, to connect it to present-day mass incarceration. Angela Davis spoke at the opening reception. She talked about learning her great-grandfather's story only recently, about the mix of pride and sorrow she felt. "He survived something meant to destroy him," she said. "And then he built a life anyway. That's resistance. That's what I want people to see. Not just the exploitation, but the fact that he walked out of those mines and kept going." Sarah thought about that later, sitting in her Nashville office, looking at a print of the baseball photo she had framed and hung on her wall. The men kneeling in the front row, the managers standing behind them. The fence with its numbers. For 100 years, the photo had circulated as evidence of enlightened management, proof that industrial companies cared about their workers' well-being. And for 100 years, the truth had been right there in the image, waiting for someone to see it. She had started finding other examples. A photograph of a turpentine camp in Florida where the workers' clothing showed signs of restraints. A portrait of a Memphis household where the young black girl standing behind the white family had a bruise on her wrist that lined up with shackle marks. A group photo from a Georgia lumber mill where the background showed a guard tower that the caption had cropped out. Each image had been displayed as heritage, as history, as a window into the past. Each image had hidden the violence it documented. Sarah wrote an article for a journal of public history, arguing that archives and museums had a responsibility to re-examine their photographic collections through the lens of forced labor and racial capitalism. She used the baseball photo as her primary example, walking readers through the process of research, the discovery of the numbers, the connection to convict leasing records. She ended the article with a call for systematic review of industrial photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly those commissioned by companies with known ties to convict leasing, sharecropping, or other forms of coerced labor. The article was published in the fall of 21, and it prompted responses from archivists across the South. A curator in Louisiana wrote about a collection of plantation photographs that had never been fully cataloged. A librarian in Mississippi described a cache of commissary records that referenced contract workers in language that matched peonage systems. An archivist in South Carolina sent images of a phosphate mining operation where the workers appeared to be restrained. Sarah had not set out to become an expert on hidden labor in historical photographs. She had bought the baseball photo on a Saturday morning because it looked interesting. But now she understood that every photograph was an argument, a claim about reality, a way of saying this is what mattered and this is how it looked. The baseball photo had argued for happy workers and enlightened companies. But the numbers on the fence told a different story, one that Sloss Sheffield had tried to paint over, one that historians and museums had ignored for a century. The photo still hangs in the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Visitors stand in front of it every day, reading the panels, studying the faces, looking at the fence. Some of them see the numbers right away. Others need the labels to point them out. But once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The image changes. It stops being a cheerful sports team and becomes evidence of a crime. It stops being nostalgia and becomes testimony. Sarah thinks about that sometimes, about how many other photographs are hanging in museums and archives and living rooms, carrying evidence that no one has learned to see yet. How many smiling faces hide coercion? How many picturesque backgrounds hide surveillance? How many carefully composed frames cut out the systems that made the image possible? The baseball photo is just one example. There are thousands more, waiting in boxes and albums and digital databases. They look ordinary at first. They seem to show ordinary things. But if you study them long enough, if you follow the details that do not quite fit, you find the fence, you find the numbers, you find the men who were leased and worked and forced to perform for a camera so that a company could say to the world, "Look how well we treat them. Look how happy they are here."